If you've never sat down and read Greta Gerwig's screenplay to her 2019 film adaptation of Little Women, I'd highly recommend taking some time for it. I mean, watch the film first, obviously, but if you're interested in screenwriting as a craft or just really like the film and want to get a greater insight into the nuts and bolts of how it works, I think reading the screenplay is a very good place to start. It's also just beautifully written. My first time reading it ended with me full-on crying at how it describes the final scene, because I'm very emotionally stable. There's a lot of great touches to appreciate in this screenplay, like how the past and present scenes are written in different colours, or the technique used to represent overlapping dialogue, but this, right here, is arguably the most important line in the whole thing. The present is now the past, or maybe fiction. It's on page 118, if you're curious, part of the slug line for the scene where Jo confesses her love for Professor Bayer. And to be clear, I'm not just saying it's the most important line because it's nice to get some very explicit validation for my opinion that whole scene was made up by Jo so her novel would sell better, and Jo actually never married, and a happy ending is her living life independently on her own terms and being an aromantic icon a century and a half before anyone even had a word for that. Though that is very nice, don't get me wrong.
So, who does she marry?
No one. She doesn't marry either of them.
It's the most important line in the screenplay because of how it connects to the film's central statement on narrative and memory. Part 1. It's all about us. Memory is obviously an important theme in Little Women 2019, but it's more than that. It is baked into the very foundations of the film. The film's radical restructuring of its source material, turning the first half of the novel into flashbacks, the memories of the characters in the present-day storyline, profoundly changes the presentation of the story. I think Patrick Willam's video on the film summarises it best. Instead of being a story about children growing up into adults, it becomes a story about adults looking back fondly on childhood. I've put a link to his video below, go watch it, it's a good one. The film is heavily concerned with how we frame the past, not just how we remember it, but the narratives we create based on those memories. This seems only natural when we think about the context to Little Women, that is, the original novel. It's no secret that author Louisa May Alcott based the novel on her own childhood and family, and Beth in particular is inspired by her sister Lizzie, who died young of complications from scarlet fever. Even without looking too much into the life of Louisa May Alcott, it's pretty obvious that protagonist and aspiring writer Jo is at least partially based on herself. Looking at any more detail at Alcott herself just makes it all the more blindingly obvious why Jo is the way she is. So many of her defining traits, from her passionate refusal to marry to her complicated relationship with gender, seem to be drawn from Alcott's own life. What we end up with is this Ouroboros of a story, a narrative snake eating its own tail. Or, as Mikey Newman puts it in his video where he discusses the 2019 film, Little Women is a book about itself. Again, link below, go watch that video, it's good and it makes me feel my feelings. In Gerwig's 2019 adaptation, another layer is added to this. It is an adaptation about adapting a book about itself. Unlike Alcott, Gerwig has the benefit of hindsight, and this ability to understand what Little Women is and what its role in the literary canon has become informs the film greatly. Because for all it's sometimes dismissed as a simple children's story or as a book that's good and a classic, but pretty typical of girl stories of the time, Little Women was genuinely a landmark. It helped to reinvent children's literature and make it what it is today. It's widely seen as an early feminist or proto-feminist work, and it's served as an inspiration to countless female authors, including Margaret Atwood and Ursula K. Le Guin. Gerwig's film sees all of this, but most importantly it recognises the autobiographical nature of Little Women and dials it up to 11. In an interview with the Script Notes podcast, Gerwig discusses how she wanted to capture this perspective of Louisa's real sister is already gone. Her sister Elizabeth died, and Louisa herself had gone to the Civil War as a Civil War nurse and had suffered through typhoid fever and almost died. And her sister, not Meg, but the character that Meg is based on, she'd gotten married and it was devastating for her. And so there's all these things of like, she is writing about a thing that already passed. It's a great interview, I'll put a link in the description. The main way in which this meta aspect comes through is in the ending. Before this film, there had already been several adaptations which blurred the lines between Alcott and her fictional avatar by having Jo end up writing her own version of Little Women. These include the beloved 1994 film and the 2005 stage musical that only I care about. But in the 2019 film, Jo writing Little Women isn't just a fun meta-detail, it's the entire framing device of the film. By the end of the film, the flashbacks to the March sisters' childhood can be interpreted not only as memories, but as a story that Jo is writing, framing the events of their childhood that shape them into the people they've become into a narrative. The film presents narrative and memory as inherently intertwined. Perhaps it's no coincidence that the first thing Jo writes that is presented as meaningful and not just a financial endeavour is the book that is explicitly based on her experiences. While the meta-ending is the most obvious example of the film's self-awareness, we get hints earlier on that the film is deeply aware both of the power of narrative and of its own role as a narrative. Even before writing her life into her novel, we get these indicators that Jo desires on some level to become a literary hero like the ones she writes. It's often overlooked in favour of the admittedly fucking fantastic monologue that follows it, but one of my favourite lines in the film is actually this line Jo has right before she claims that if Laurie proposed again she'd say yes.
If I was a girl in a book, this would all be so easy. Just give up the world happily.
We know from the fun little meta joke in the beginning where Jo's publisher tells her that her book needs to end with the heroine either married or dead, that in the Society of Little Women, a girl in a book kind of necessarily means a girl who ends up married. It's like a more subtle admission of what she says outright a few minutes later, that despite wanting to remain a free spinster, she's still lonely. One thing that sets Little Women 2019 apart from other adaptations is how much it emphasises the fact that Jo wishes she could fall in love and end up happily married like her sisters. I mean, God, I still don't think I've really processed how uniquely heartbreaking her telling Laurie, "I can't, I've tried it and I failed," is. And here, in the moment where she feels most powerless, Jo retreats back to the only narrative she knows, the only happy ending she's been allowed to imagine for herself as a woman in the 19th century, and it's enough to convince her that maybe marrying the man she's always seen as a brother would be a good idea. Which again is uniquely heartbreaking, but I also kind of love it because it adds another layer to her decision to write her novel based on her own life instead of writing yet another gruesome thriller. It allows her to quite literally take control of the narrative, and in doing so give herself back a little bit of power. Part 2. Writing them will make them more important. But how does this connect to the theme of memory? Well, the restructuring of the text to turn the first half into a series of flashbacks means that nostalgia lies at the heart of the film, and the film increasingly blurs the line of whether these flashbacks are depicting the past as it actually happened, or if they're depicting the story the characters tell themselves about what happened. The childhood sequences are bathed in this warm glow, as if we're literally looking back at the events with rose-coloured glasses. The present, in contrast, is coloured with cold, harsh tones. It's a very simple visual shorthand, but at the same time it's incredibly effective at making us feel like we're seeing these events directly from the March sisters' points of view. Even aside from the actual content of the two timelines, this visual language puts us in the headspace of these adults looking back on their childhood and yearning for that simpler time, and it makes me cry over colour grading. Isn't that fun? As the film goes on, this contrast between the simple, happy world of childhood and the harsh, unforgiving world of adulthood is hammered in over and over again. It's arguably the film's strongest thematic thread, and much like the autobiographical elements of the novel, it comes to the forefront when Beth dies, the biggest emotional turning point of the story. The same shot choices are used to emphasise the contrast between Jo waking up in the past to find that Beth has recovered from her illness, and Jo waking up in the present to find that Beth has died. It's the most extreme, literal interpretation of this idea that in childhood things always work out easily, and in adulthood everything is so much harder. Despite the warm sentimentality of the nostalgic childhood scenes, the film is also aware that nostalgia, while pleasant, isn't always healthy. For many people, including the March sisters, nostalgia is a way to escape from the difficulties of life instead of facing them. We see this in all the sisters, at least to an extent. For example, in the way the film transitions from Meg dancing at a ball, not a care in the world, to Meg in the present having to worry about her family and their money problems. But Jo is the protagonist, so these nostalgic memories are mainly seen through her eyes. Her sisters may miss the innocence of childhood, but Jo is the only one who seems actively stuck in the past. I've seen some people say that this is because she's immature, and while I don't disagree with that, I do think it's deeply reductive to attribute her desire to return to the past she can no longer find purely to immaturity. Jo is someone who we constantly see being told she doesn't have a future. Aside from Mommy, almost everyone around her believes that Jo's commitment to never marrying is untenable, and that she is eventually going to have to get over it and marry well, otherwise how can she support herself and her family? The line about her heroine having to be either married or dead by the end isn't just about literature, it's the reality of a world where for a woman the unspoken alternative to marriage is presumably dying in poverty. This is the world that Jo has to contend with. So yes, her retreat into the past is partly a way to escape the trials of adult life, but it goes deeper than that. Jo is desperate not to leave the past behind because some part of her believes she has no other option. There's no future for her, so the past is all she has. This isn't to say, however, that the film treats nostalgia as a wholly bad thing. Although Jo matures greatly over the course of the film, she never entirely abandons her nostalgia. Instead, she adopts a healthier attitude to the past, recognising its importance to her while at the same time being ready to finally move forward. Which brings us back to the power of narrative, and the importance of how we frame our experiences. We tell stories to make sense of our experiences, both to ourselves and to others, and Jo's character reflects this. She writes to support her family, but it's so much more than that.
No one gets ink stains like yours just out of a desire for money.
Well, my sister Amy's in Paris, and until she marries someone obscenely wealthy, it's up to me to keep the family afloat.
Jo longs desperately to be understood by a world that emphatically refuses to understand her. Her aunt sees her nonconformity as childish and immature, and insists that she'll one day have to suck it up and marry some rich guy, and when Jo shows no sign of doing so, she's dismissed as a lost cause. Laurie, her best friend, doesn't understand her when she rejects his proposal, and dismisses it when she tells him she doesn't think she'll ever marry. Even her own sisters don't really understand her, believing that she'll one day want to join the rest of them in getting married. The only person who shows her any real understanding on this front is her mother, who, at Jo's lowest point after Beth dies, gently discourages her from her stance that she'd accept if Laurie proposed again, pointing out that wanting to be loved is not the same as loving, and she shouldn't marry someone she doesn't love. This scene is maybe the only time in the entire film that anyone meets her on her own terms. This makes Jo finally writing her novel important in a very spiritual sense. It's not just the financial success her family needs, it represents a direct challenge to a society that can't understand her by writing something so deeply, painfully personal. It is her final plea for understanding from a world that is so cold and harsh. As such, there's a note of tragedy when her publisher forces her to change the ending. Sure, by turning her own story into something more conventional, she's able to achieve the success she's always wanted, but she's also robbed of her own honesty. It's the same compromise that Louisa May Alcott had to make when she published Little Women. For all the people who've been disappointed by Jo's somewhat out-of-nowhere marriage at the end of the book, it might be vindicating to know that Alcott never wanted Jo to marry. She wanted her to remain a literary spinster, but such an ending for a female character just wouldn't fly at the time, and so we ended up with Professor Bear showing up kind of out of nowhere to be a love interest for Jo, essentially because Alcott thought that would be kind of funny and took the stance of, hey, if I have to write the ending that the publishers want, I'm going to write it on my own terms, and, good for her on that, but it's still a shame to me that Alcott was never able to write her honest vision, and instead had to change it to something more conventional for the time. I think there's something kind of beautiful about the way the 2019 film adaptation changes the ending to make it ambiguous whether Jo marries Professor Bear, or if she goes on to lead the life that Alcott originally wanted for her, because it gives that honesty back, both to Alcott and to her fictional alter ego. Jo might not be able to make herself understood by the world within the diegesis of the film, but the fact that she's the protagonist in the first place allows her to finally be understood by us, the audience. And yeah, if you're feeling uncharitable, maybe that ending can come across as insufferably meta and pretentious, but personally, I think it's beautiful. The kind of beauty that you only really get from what is, at its core, the story of a book about itself. In conclusion, storytelling is something so fundamentally human. Perhaps it is the thing that separates people from animals. Unless you ask Johnny Sims, in which case the thing that separates us is that we're capable of choosing to do evil, but I think my version's maybe a little more optimistic. The problem that Jo faces as an aspiring author is that she lives in a world which just isn't interested in the story she has to tell. When presented with a novel that she'd carved so painfully from her own experiences, her publisher snidely remarks that,
if you decide to end your delightful book with your heroine a spinster, no one will buy it. It won't be worth printing.
It's played as a joke about the sexism of the time period, but honestly, if we follow the interpretation that Jo and Bear's romance was made up to sell the novel, that Jo was talking about herself when she says her heroine doesn't marry either of them, it's kind of painful. Imagine being told that your lived experience, the life you've fought for, doesn't count as a happy ending, that it's not something anyone would want to read about. Looking at it from this angle, Jo's story is kind of depressing. She remains locked out of the narrative and prevented from expressing herself honestly. And yet it's hopeful at the same time. She's achieved her dream of publishing a novel, and if we assume that the fictional Little Women is received the same as the real novel, she will finally have the financial success she needs to support her family, the way she always wanted and the way that Alcott did in real life. She has a future ahead of her, one she never believed she could have. She is happy at last, in defiance of a world that tried so hard to beat her down. And hey, Jo might not have wholly succeeded in this frantic last-ditch effort to communicate herself, but if this adaptation proves anything, it's that there is a place for her story. The skepticism of people like Dashwood doesn't change the fact that her experiences do have value. I hope that if we take one thing away from Jo's story, it's that sometimes the only thing you can do in a society that wasn't built for you is keep trying to communicate yourself, to be so loud they can't ignore you. Or, to quote the greatest and most triumphant celebration of artistic expression of all time, Sing by My Chemical Romance, sing it from the heart, sing until you're nuts, sing it out for the ones that'll hate your guts, sing it for the deaf, sing it for the blind, sing about everyone that you left behind, sing it for the world, sing it for the world.